So welcome everyone to the Pearson Business Book Club. My name is Eloise Cook and I'm the publisher for the professional business list at Pearson. And we're also celebrating our first anniversary of the book club. This is our 12th session, and you can also find any older sessions on the book club website. So if you've not joined before, we choose a Pearson business or personal development book each month at the book club, and we invite the author on to discuss it. And they'll also give a masterclass on a key concept from the book. Now, if you need to leave halfway through, we are recording this session and then it will be available to watch on demand at the book club website. Okay, so what's our book this month? This is Inside the Leaders Club by Michael Skapinker. And if you haven't got a copy yet, you can buy a copy through the book club webpage. And we also want you to use the Q&A function to ask questions, and we'll get Michael to answer these at the end. So I'm going to introduce Michael. Michael is a contributing editor at the Financial Times, where he was a reporter, senior editor, and award-winning columnist for 34 years. Crikey. You're an experienced management educator and have run leadership development programs at some of the world's leading organizations, including the European Central Bank, Siemens, Santander, and Clifford Chance. You are also a registered counsellor with the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy, specialising in helping people think through their work, career, and retirement issues. Fantastic. Welcome, Michael. How are you?
Thank you, Eloise. Very well. Very nice to be here. And thank you all who are attending today.
Yeah. I hope we've got a lot of people in the room. So let's start with our usual questions for you. So we like to ask the same questions to our authors. Can you tell me, why did you want to write this book?
Well, the origin of this book is an organization that the Financial Times has called FT Forums. And this is a networking organization for managers, up-and-coming managers, and women managers from different companies to meet each other and to listen to very senior speakers on a range of issues. So FT Forums has had a lot of very interesting speakers. They've had people like Kofi Annan and Bill Gates, all sorts of people, leaders, CEOs, and I moderated quite a lot of these. And at the end of one of them, and they're recorded as well, they're under the Chatham House rule, which means that people shouldn't be quoted at them. But afterwards, after one of them, I said to Mike Hepburn, who's the managing director of FT Forums, you know, Mike, we've got such an enormous amount of material here and it's all recorded. Have you ever thought of doing a book with this? And he said, oh, what an interesting idea. And I think he approached you, Eloise, with the idea. And that was the origin of the book. So it had its basis in the talks that were given at FT Forums, and all of the speakers, without exception, generously agreed to waive their right not to be quoted under the Chatham House rule. They all agreed to be quoted. And then I added to the book a lot of other material from the FT and other publications, and also my own thoughts from many decades of writing about management and being a manager, and that was the book. And my idea was to create a book which would be of interest to anybody who has been a leader, who wants to be a leader, who's interested in how leaders work. And between us, Eloise, we came up with the subjects that we thought were going to be most interesting. Some of these were general leadership subjects, how to form a team, how to inspire your team, but also a lot of other subjects. We looked at digital addiction. Does it exist? What to do about it? We looked at how companies had to deal with ESG issues, with environment, social, and governance. We looked at how companies should deal with climate change. We looked at AI, which was a very quickly developing theme then and has developed, as we know, even more quickly since. So that was the idea, and the way it worked, you'll remember, Eloise, I wrote 2 chapters at a time. I sent them to you. This was during lockdown, which I'll come back to in a moment. So we never met. We used to have Zoom calls like this. I used to send you 2 chapters and you'd send them back with your comments and suggestions. your comments and suggestions, I have to say, were disarmingly on the nail, Eloise. There wasn't a single one where I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. The experience of having a publisher really showed. And that's how we got through the book. And the idea was, as I say, for a book about leaders and for leaders, or for people who want to be leaders.
Yeah, and I think we've got that. We've got your journalistic flair, and we've got this kind of insight into what was happening at the forum. So even for people who weren't there, it sort of feels like a special sneak preview into the big answers to those pressing questions.
And that was the idea, and the title, Inside the Leaders Club, to take people inside the minds of these people who've led organizations, who've transformed organizations. What did they mean? And also, how did people respond to them?
Absolutely. And so, was there anything that surprised you about writing this book?
Well, I was thinking about this while I was thinking about what I was going to say at the session. I would say the biggest surprise was the circumstance under which I found myself writing the book. And if I can come back, so I started as a journalist over 40 years ago. And if I think about what journalism was like in those days, we would write, I used to write. In those days, we used to type out our articles on a typewriter. We used to then type them out on a telex machine. Perhaps some of you here today can remember what a telex machine was. Send it off by telex machine. And that was how we did it. It was all for printed press. I used to also be a broadcast journalist. I used to be a radio journalist. That meant recording on a cassette tape, then disassembling the phone mouthpiece, and physically with what were called crocodile clips, connecting your cassette tape to the phone. So I had no idea of the technology we were going to be dealing with now 40 years later. No idea that we were going to be producing news which would appear on laptop computers. Of course, I'd never heard of a laptop computer. It would appear on mobile phones. We didn't have mobile phones. I didn't know anything about podcasts or, online video or anything like that. So I had got used to the fact that technology was going to change continuously. What I never imagined was that we were going to all be working from home, absolutely locked down and unable to leave our neighborhoods during the biggest pandemic in a century. I suppose that's what surprised me the most. And what surprised me most of all, and I'm going to be talking about this, was how smoothly everything went. We managed to carry on running our organizations. The FT is published and edited from 3 different places. It's edited from London, New York, and Hong Kong. And there were days, quite a few days, when the FT was produced both in print and online without a single person in any of those 3 offices. Wow. So that was quite extraordinary. So the circumstances, I suppose, were a surprise to me. And what I found myself doing, I was writing the book. I was doing my executive education online, teaching people all over the world, whether that was in San Francisco or New Delhi or Auckland. And also during that time, as you mentioned at the beginning, I carried on studying. I'd been studying at night for a while, becoming a counselor. I had planned to become, and I have become, a counselor specializing in people's work issues, specializing in people's problems at work, their retirement issues. And so I completed that as well. As you said, qualifying, I qualified at the end of last year. So that was the biggest surprise of all. What were we doing under these circumstances? It was not something I'd ever expected.
And yes, it sort of seems almost bizarre now how we all sort of moved into not working during the pandemic, and it was all quite fairly seamless, but and to sort of think back in those days is very bizarre indeed. So how do you want readers to feel after they've read your book?
After I'd completed the book, I sent it to a few people, and the nicest comment I got, the most interesting one, was from Linda Grattan. Linda Grattan, name some of you may know, is a professor at London Business School. And she's the co-author with Andrew Scott of an absolutely fascinating, I think one of the most important books of recent years, which is called The 100-Year Life, which is about how we deal with the fact that we are living longer, and we don't want to give up working. We want to continue to participate in society, to make a contribution. And Linda said to me that she felt about my book, and I really like this as an idea. She said she felt she was at a dinner party, having a dinner party conversation. She found the tone of the book conversational and interesting. And I like that because it gave me a sense, and I hope we're going to see some of that here today. I wanted the book to be interactive in a sense. I wanted people to think about it, maybe make their own notes, maybe make have their own thoughts about what was going on. So I'd like people to go away from my book. I mean, business changes very fast, and I reread the book again over the last week. Most of it has held up pretty well, but some things inevitably change during the period of producing a book and publishing a book. So I think what I'd like most of all is for people to take this away and to regard it as part of a conversation rather than something definitive, something that they can add to, something they can think about, because I'm just very aware of the fact that so many people have their own thoughts about what leadership involves and what they should be doing. So I think that's what I'd like people to take away from this, something to make it part of their lives, part of their conversation.
Absolutely, yes, and I totally agree with you. You know, at Pearson, we want to publish books that have longevity and shelf life, but of course we can't account for everything. And if we had a book on ChatGPT, it would be out of date by the end of today. Although,
and I was thinking about this, I had in our chapter on AI, we did have a conclusion saying one of the most interesting things happening is OpenAI, the company that's producing ChatGPT, and looking at some of the things that might happen. But as you say, Eloise, I mean, that sort of broke on the world towards the end of last year and has had an enormous impact on all of us, which we can perhaps talk about later. But I'm pleased that we did actually say this is coming up. This is something to watch for.
Yes, you're very eagle-eyed, Michael. You tick.
Well, I think there was a lucky break.
Right, so it's time for the masterclass, which is what does leadership look like after COVID? So very topical, very interesting. So if you do want to ask Michael any questions, just pop them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them towards the end. So I will leave you to it.
Thank you very much, Eloise, and thank you to all of you. As Eloise said, I'd very much like to hear from all of you, so please do put any questions that you have, but also any comments in the Q&A, because I know that Eloise is going to bring them up later. So we're going to talk today about what does leadership look like after COVID. And I thought I'd maybe start this by talking about my own experience of leadership, which came to me, I suppose, relatively late in my career. And I'd just like to talk about what it involved. So as I said a bit earlier, I began working as a journalist in the early 1980s, just over 40 years ago. And I started out as a foreign correspondent working in Greece. This was in the early 1980s. This was a very interesting time to be in Greece. It was not long after the fall of the Greek dictatorship, the colonel's dictatorship. There was the rise to power of Andreas Papandreou, who was a firebrand, a socialist leader. Very interesting time to be there. I had a couple of very enjoyable years reporting on Greece, reporting on Turkey, reporting on Cyprus, and really learning the trade of being a journalist. Then in 1984, I came back to the UK, where I'd been a student. You might have picked up that I grew up in South Africa, but I'd been a student in the UK. And I came back in 1984, wanting to work as a journalist in London. The newspaper I really, really wanted to work for was the Financial Times. I had always admired the Financial Times. I thought it was a great paper. And what I particularly liked about the Financial Times, it always struck me as a newspaper that could be counted on to tell the truth, to be as accurate as possible. And I really liked the style of journalism. I really wanted to be part of it. So I came back to London, applied to the Financial Times for a job and was rejected. And actually, looking back on it, I kept a file. I was rejected for over 40 jobs that I applied for as a journalist when I got back to London. But eventually I got a job. I got a job as a trade journalist for a company called McGraw-Hill, which had various trade publications, and I worked for them as an energy correspondent. I wrote about the energy industry. I wrote about oil, coal, gas, and how they were developing. And then after a while, I got a job with a small little magazine that McGraw-Hill had called International Management. In the meantime, I'd applied a second time to be a journalist at the Financial Times, been told, no, sorry. In fact, I didn't even get an interview that time. And then I remember sitting in my office at International Management, and a journalist next door, who was a very experienced man, came in. Just before open plan, we all had these little cubbyhole offices. He came into my office and he said, I've just got the Financial Times on the phone, and they are looking for a management writer. Do we know anybody? And I said, well, what about me? And he said, hadn't thought of that. All right, well, I'll suggest you. Anyway, it was quite a long process. I had a total of 11 interviews at the Financial Times. It clearly took them a while to make up their minds about me. But eventually, I achieved my dream job, journalist at the Financial Times. And I remember walking for the first time into the Financial Times headquarters at Bracken House, opposite St. Paul's Cathedral in London. I walked in, I looked around, and I thought, I never want to work anywhere else ever again. And I had an absolutely wonderful time at the Financial Times. As I said, I wrote about management to start with. The great thing about the Financial Times is they move you around a lot. They move you from job to job. So I worked as a management writer. I then worked covering different industries, reporting on different industries. I reported on the electronics industry. I reported on the leisure industries. I reported on the aerospace and aviation industries. And then I went back to writing about management and leadership as a columnist, until after about 20 years on the Financial Times, I finally got the chance to be a manager and a leader. I was appointed as editor of the weekend Financial Times. And I thought, well, this is my opportunity. This is my chance to put into practice all the things that I've learned writing and reading about management and talking to people about management. And what I discovered when I got to this very senior job as editor of the Weekend FT, that I really didn't know very much about management. I really didn't know how to do it. Now, I had an idea of how I was going to do it. It was a time then when the newspaper industry was really being turned upside down by the internet. The print editions of these newspapers were really being damaged. Print circulation was falling. Print advertising was falling. And I had done an analysis before getting this job. And I had come up with the idea that I knew what to do and I could see what the problem was. I felt that the problem was we'd become too much like the other weekend papers. Too much involved in lifestyle issues, too many soft features. Now, lifestyle, arts, culture, these things are all absolutely vital to the Weekend Financial Times. But I thought we needed to go back a bit more to what we did best, really insightful writing on international politics, international business, thoughts about various important things. And so I went in and I told the staff that that's what we needed to do. And to my surprise and to my disappointment, they basically didn't listen. It wasn't what they did. And this was my first lesson in management. Being a leader, being a manager is not just about going in and telling people what to do. You can't just be an enforcer. I made a very early discovery that one of the hardest things to get people to do is to change what they were doing before, because they're very committed and very involved in what they were doing before. I made the discovery that it's quite a long process getting people on your side, talking to them, really listening to them, because they've also got their own experiences and they've got the things that they think are best done in the best way. And you've got to really spend your time talking to them about how best to change things and how best to do things. I started to develop the idea that rather than being an enforcer as a leader, you had to become an enabler. And I had, close to a decade then, as a senior manager, as one of the leadership team on the Financial Times. After the Weekend Financial Times, I became the head of the Financial Times Specialist Reports Department. There are reports on different countries, different regions, which was a very important part of the Financial Times. And really slowly, and through learning from my mistakes, of which I made many, how to be a leader. And I started to think about this difference, and this underlies much of what I'm going to talk about today from the book, that really for all the discussions that we have, all the books that are written, all the articles are written, all the academic dissertations that are written about leadership, there really are only two kinds of leadership. There's telling people what to do, and there's helping them to do something. Now, this is a debate that's been going on a long time, and much of what I'm going to be saying today is from the first two chapters of the book and the last chapter, chapter 10 of the book, but it takes in some of the other issues within the book itself. And this debate that has gone back really a long time, goes back as much as 60 years. There was an American business school academic, a professor called Douglas McGregor, who in 1960 wrote a very interesting article called The Human Side of Enterprise. And that Douglas McGregor came up with the idea that there are, as I say, two sides of management. He called them Theory X and Theory Y. Theory X assumed that people don't want to work. They don't want to do a good job. You've got to force them to do it. And you've got to essentially treat them like children. That was Theory X. And that was the style, and remains the style, of many leaders and many managers, that business of telling people what to do. He also then talked about Theory Y, which was treating people who work with you like grown-ups, assuming they want to do a good job, they want to achieve great things, and really helping them to get there. So I think this has been an ongoing debate, and we've all seen both sides of leaders, these enforcers, the people who tell people what to do, and the enablers, the people who encourage people, the people who take people forward with them. It's a debate, as I say, which has been going on for decades. And then we had COVID, and we had lockdown, and we had people working from home all over the world. Now, I should say, and it's a point that I make repeatedly in the book, not everybody could work from home. There were people who had to be at work because they were frontline workers. We had doctors, nurses, care home workers, old people's home workers. They had to be there. We had our supermarket workers who got the food to us, the delivery drivers, the distribution people, the drivers who delivered our Amazon parcels, delivered our Deliveroo meals. All of those people had to carry on working in person, but many of us began to work from home. And leaders who dealt with people working from home, as I said a bit earlier, there were days when in the Financial Times' entire international global network, there was not a single person in the office. And that was replicated in many companies around the world. Here you had managers who no longer had people sitting in front of them, no longer had people who could say, I'm going to tell you what to do and you have to do it. They had to trust them. They had to believe that they would do the work that they were required to do without somebody standing over them. And generally speaking, and for the most part, they did. It's extraordinary how well companies continued, extraordinary how well organizations continue to function without their leaders standing over them. And what we had, in effect, during the pandemic and during lockdown was managers as enablers, Douglas McGregor's Theory Y, managers treating their workers like grown-ups by default. During lockdown, they had no choice. And now we're in the post-lockdown period, and coming to the title of my talk, what does leadership look like in the post-COVID era? COVID, of course, has not gone away. It's still around. It may still come back to ambush us. But the World Health Organization has said that the emergency period of the pandemic is over. And we can, to a very large extent, and have to a very large extent, gone back to our old lives. Now, during lockdown, I used to wonder about what would change permanently as a result of the pandemic. One of the things I thought would change is I thought we would stop shaking hands. I mean, this is sort of, a very strange and unhygienic practice. I didn't see any reason why people would go back to shaking hands when we've got used to bumping elbows or just sort of nodding to people when we met them. But as far as I can see, people have gone back to shaking hands. I also thought, and in the last couple of years at the Financial Times, I used to write a business travel column before lockdown and actually well into lockdown. I thought international travel, international air travel would take a very, very long time to come back after COVID, if in fact it did at all. Business travel is taking a while to come back, but as you all know, leisure travel has come back in a very, very big way. And some airlines are saying that even leisure travelers, they're so excited about getting back to traveling, they're so excited about getting back to seeing the world, that they're prepared to pay for seats at the front of the plane. They're prepared to pay for business class or first class. And even in the low-cost airline sphere, some of you might have seen the news this week that Ryanair made a profit last year of 1.4 billion euros. That compared with a loss of 430 million euros the year before. So a lot of things have got back to normal. But the one thing, as you all know, that has not returned to its pre-COVID state is people going back to the office. The working week has changed. In most city centers, the days in the office seem to have settled into Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Monday's not a big day, and Friday is pretty much dead. It used to be that in the City of London, the global financial center, the financial center of the City of London, Friday night used to be the massive night at the pubs with people spilling out into the streets. Pub owners are now saying Thursday night is their biggest night. Thursday is the new Friday. Other signs that we've seen, City AM, a business financial free newspaper which is handed out to commuters in London, they have announced that they are not going to publish any longer a print edition on a Friday. There just aren't enough commuters to justify having a newspaper every day of the week. So that is one thing which has really, really changed. People have not returned to the office. Now, there are some bosses who've had to get used to this, have to develop new ways of hybrid working, and I'm going to talk about those. But there are others who really, really don't like this idea. They really don't like the fact that people are not coming back to the office. Even during lockdown, we had David Solomon, the head of Goldman Sachs, calling working from home an aberration that we're going to correct as soon as possible. Other leaders really haven't liked the fact that people aren't coming back into the office. Elon Musk at Tesla, he said, you want to work here, you've got to be in the office. When he took over Twitter, he fired a lot of people. And he said to the rest of them, you've got to be here every day. But in most places, when leaders say, come back to the office, workers are just saying, no, we're not doing it. We've got used to spending some of our days at home, and we're going to carry on doing this. And they can carry on doing this because, and I think this is one of the most important points I want to make, in many parts of the world now, workers have the upper hand. Power is in the hands of employees, and employees are increasingly decided what they are going to do and what they're not going to do. I was talking to somebody that I know who is a senior person in a very big international company, a very prestigious company that a lot of people would want to work for. And she told me she was interviewing somebody, a very, very attractive candidate for a job. And he said to her, how many days a week will I have to come into the office? And she said, well, we like people to come in 3 days a week. And he said, well, no, actually, I'm only going to come in 2 days a week. And she looked at him and she thought, well, I'm in the position now where I can either tell you that's not going to work and you're going to walk away and you're not going to have any trouble finding another job, or I'm just going to have to accept this and just get used to it. And I think many employers find themselves in this position now where their employees are making the decision about whether they're going to work in the office. So why has this happened? One of the things I started to do during lockdown is go for a long walk every day and listen to an audiobook. And I generally listen to one audiobook a month. But I then started on a very, very long audiobook. It was so long that it actually took me 4 or 5 months to listen to it. It's a book by a British historian called Simon Sebag Montefiore, and it's called The World, A Family History. In its print version, it is 1,344 pages long, a real history of the world, quite a tour de force, but a very, very interesting one. And one of the things that struck me is Simon Sebag Montefiore talks about the bubonic plague in the 14th century. And he talks about the death and destruction that it caused, quite extraordinary mortality rates, extraordinary death rates. during the bubonic plague. In England, for example, he says that in the 14th century, 50% of the population died of the plague. In Venice, it was 75% who died, and in parts of Egypt, 98% died. And he talks about what the impact was of so many people dying. And what happened is there just was a shortage of workers. There weren't enough people to do the job. And the result is those workers who had survived became much more powerful. Their wages went up. They began to form guilds, the trade unions of the time. Fewer workers means more power. Now, what's happened after COVID? COVID was a terrible time. I'm sure we all have friends, family members, colleagues. We all know people who died of COVID. It was an absolutely awful time. The World Health Organization said recently that officially there were around 7 million people died of COVID, COVID-registered deaths. In reality, they think that the figure was probably 3 times that much, over 20 million people dying of COVID. And that's a tragedy. It's a tragedy. Every single one of those 20 million people has left loved ones behind. But it's not the kind of death rates that we saw during the bubonic plague. On its own, it cannot account for the fact that there's now a shortage of workers. That is something that was happening long before COVID. And it's because in many parts of the world, North America, Europe, China, South Korea, we're just not having many children. The figures in the number of families having children are quite startling. In 1960, worldwide, the average woman would have 5 children during the course of her life. By 2020, that had gone down to 2.4. In other words, it had more than halved. And that 2.4 is quite misleading because there are still parts of the world where birth rates are quite high. If we look at specific countries, in China and the US, the average woman has 1.8 children. In the UK, it's 1.7. In Japan, it's 1.4. And in Korea, it's 1. The average woman just has 1 child. So as societies, we are not replacing ourselves. The difference has to be made up by immigration. And as we all know, that is a very controversial subject in many parts of the world. There just aren't enough people. And as a result, there's a shortage of workers, and those workers have more power. One of the reasons why, when they say we're not coming back to the office, there's nothing much organizations and companies can do about it. If they insist, if you are a really, really top organization, maybe people really want to work at Goldman Sachs, maybe they put up with it. Otherwise, they can walk and go somewhere else. Now, I just want to talk about what people can do about this and how leaders can approach this. But before I do, I'd just like to make a point, and I quote this in the book. I quote James Sussman, who's an anthropologist and author, who at one of the FT Forum's meetings talked about the fact that the way we work now, the way in which we operate and the way in which we operate it, and in other words, millions of people going on a train into an office, sitting there all day, and then at the end of the day, all getting onto another packed train and going home is relatively recent. It's something that happened during the 20th century, and particularly after the Second World War. James Sussman said before that, we worked very differently. We often worked from home. People worked, they either had workshop in their houses or they worked in places very near to their houses. We had, cities were divided into different areas where people did different jobs, different quartiers, where people did different things, where people pursued different trades. And as he said, there was not that much of a gap. There was not that much of a division between people's work lives and their family and personal lives. And in some ways, we've now gone back to that. Of course, we're not working locally anymore because we have these remarkable communication tools, Zoom and all the rest of it, the way I'm talking to you at the moment. So we can basically combine our work and our family lives in ways that we just really weren't doing before. Now, In the book, I talk about how some companies are dealing with it. A lot of organizations have got to get used to managing hybrid work, and leaders have had to get used to leading hybrid workers. And I'll talk for a few minutes about how we can do that, because I'm sure you've also got your own ideas. I'll just mention the fact, though, some companies are being quite creative about this. In my book, I refer to Arup, the international engineering company. And this was based on reporting done in the Financial Times by Emma Jacobs, one of my colleagues. They have got a program called Work Unbound, where instead of saying you come in these days and you stay at home, you come in 3 days, you stay at home the others, Arup works across all 7 days of the week, saying to people, adjust your work to suit your circumstances. If you've got children to drop off at school, children to help with their homework, if you want to go to the gym, you want to go for a run, take that time off and then make up the time later. Maybe you want to work later at night. Maybe actually you want to work on the weekend. So that's one way to do it. What I'd like to do just for the last 5-10 minutes before I turn to your questions, and please do put your questions in the Q&A, is I'd just like to talk about some of the things I think are important for leaders in this hybrid working environment, things you really need to do. And I'm sure many of you have got your own experiences of this and your own ideas. The first thing, I think this is really, really vital, absolutely top of the heap, is I think leaders have got to ensure that they understand and can communicate their organization's purpose. Why are we here? What is important to us? Just to refer to the company where I worked for so many years, the Financial Times. The Financial Times outlines its purpose in a motto, which appears just under the masthead in the newspaper. And that motto is, without fear and without favor. In other words, Financial Times journalism is completely independent. Financial Times journalists are schooled to tell the truth no matter what pressure they're under, whether that's pressure from government, whether that's pressure from our own advertisers. We don't submit to pressure from them. They try sometimes. They threaten to withdraw their advertising. It has no impact on what we write. I'd just like to tell you a little story about my early days on the Financial Times and how this actually worked in practice. I'd only been on the FT for a couple of months. I was sent to I was sent to a conference to report on a conference about drugs in the workplace. There were speakers talking about drugs in the workplace. And there was a speaker from one of the big drugs charities. And he said that their research had shown that in the City of London, London's financial district, in the City of London, 1/3 of workers were using cocaine in the workplace. And I thought, wow, that's an amazing statistic. 1/3 using cocaine at work. But he didn't tell us how he'd worked this out. He didn't explain what their research had been, didn't say how they'd established this. So during the coffee break, I went up to him and I said, you know what you said about 1/3 of people in the city using cocaine at work? Can you tell me how this research was done? And he went a kind of bright shade of pink, quite similar really to the color of the Financial Times. And he said, well, it's a bit of poetic license, really. We haven't got exact figures, but our impression is that 1/3 of people are using cocaine at work. So I thought, well, I can't really write that because the editors will say, how do you know this? So I carried on sitting and reporting on this conference. And fortunately, another big story came up. At that time, there was a lot of controversy in the US about US federal employees having to submit to drugs tests at work. And they were having to give urine samples at work. And there was a British minister speaking at the conference, a name you might remember, David Mellor. And somebody asked him whether British civil servants were going to be subjected to drugs tests like there had been in the US. And he said, no, they weren't. The UK government had no intention of instituting drugs tests for UK civil servants. I thought, all right, well, that's my story. It's a good story. I went back to the office. I wrote the story. I sent it down to the news desk. A couple of hours later, my phone rang. It was the news editor who sat one floor down. And he said to me, the Evening Standard, London's evening newspaper, has just arrived. And the whole of the front page is dominated by one big headline. It says 1/3 of the city on coke. And he said to me, I don't see this reflected anywhere in your story. And I said to him, well, I asked the guy who said this, and he pretty much admitted to me that he'd made it up. So I decided not to put it in my article. And I half expected him to say, well, if everybody else is going to write it, we have to write it too, or, you know, we can't let the others write it if we don't. But he didn't say that. He just said to me, okay, thanks, goodbye. And he put the phone down. And I thought, okay, this is how we work. If something's not true, we don't write it. And I think allied to this idea of purpose, I think what is so important for leaders is to live that purpose. It's not enough to just have a mission statement or just have a statement of what you are. You've got to show by how you lead that you actually are going to do that, and that everybody can count on you to behave the way you say the organization is going to behave. So I think that is a very important aspect of this, purpose and living that purpose. Second, setting goals. If people are going to be working in a hybrid way, if they're not going to be under your control anymore, you have to be able to set goals and then leave it to them as to how they get to those goals. Perhaps coach people through those goals, but make sure that they have the right to do it. As I say, if they're not in the office every day, if they're not sitting in front of you, you've got to be able to trust them. And setting goals is also about having trust. Now, having said all this, there's a lot about this new post-COVID way of working that we don't really know much about yet. And a lot of these have already been talked about. For example, how do people learn? How do they gain that implicit knowledge if they're not in the office every day, if they're not listening to people who've been there longer than them all the time? Also, how do we reach those creative decisions that come through serendipity, through people bumping into each other, through people staying on after a meeting and chatting? How are we going to do all that? I think all of this is still to be worked out. We don't really know entirely where we are going just yet. But I think the one thing we do know is I feel the style of management has changed irrevocably. It was happening anyway, but I think COVID was one of those big breaks, one of those disruptions, which leads to us doing things in an entirely different way. And I think it's changed the nature of leadership. Whatever happens now, and as I said, there's still a lot of things that we've got to work out. I think the days of the leader as dictator, the leader who says, I'm going to tell you what to do, you've got to be in at 9 o'clock every morning, and I'm going to watch you do that. I don't think we're going to come back to that. I think we are in a situation now and in an era now where as leaders, we have to be enablers. I think what COVID has done is has really weighted the argument, as I say, an argument that has been going on for decades in favor of those leaders who know how to bring people along rather than to tell them what to do. And I don't think we're going to be going back to those days of the leader as enforcer. So that's what I have to say up until now, and I'll hand it back to you, Eloise.
Wow, thank you, Michael. That was absolutely fascinating. I really sort of, that last point spoke to me about the leaders as enablers, because of this question of sort of working from home. I know some people, I know some companies that are mandating particular time in the office, and I think for me that just feels a bit alien now, a bit strange, and yeah, there's a sort of lack of trust there. But yeah, absolutely fascinating. So if you've got questions for Michael, please pop them in the Q&A and we'll get round to them. We've got some already, some practical questions for you, Michael. How do you build trust between a manager and their team? And do you think office working will return to build stronger relationships with teams?
So how to build trust with your team. I talk about this quite a bit in the book, and I quote somebody called John Amici, who some of you may know. John is an organizational psychologist. He is a fascinating character. He was an NBA basketball player in the US, a sort of top basketball player, and is now a very influential organizational psychologist. And he talks about how do you build trust? I think you build trust by trusting. If you say to somebody, I'll give you an example. When as I said, I ran the FT special report section, and by then I'd learned a little bit more about being a leader. Nobody's the finished article. We've all got a lot to learn, but I learned a little bit more. And I remember I came in on the first day and I said to everybody, I really don't want to know, and you don't need to tell me whether you've got a dentist appointment or you've got a parents' evening. You're adults. I want this to be a grown-up department. People were editing particular projects. As I said, these were specialist reports on countries or on industries. And I said to people, just get them done. I insist on a very, very high level of work. This is the Financial Times. We can't make mistakes. This thing has got to be pretty much perfect. But how you get there is up to you. And I remember I had one editor who had a sort of quite erratic style of working. I'd sometimes see there'd been an email from him at 3 in the morning. You know, he just used to sort of get things done when he wanted, but he always delivered. He always delivered. And I remember on one occasion, one of my deputies came to me in an absolute panic and said, this report is meant to be published in an hour and he's gone on holiday. And I said, he'll publish it. Don't worry about it. Even if it's the last thing he does from his laptop on the plane as the doors are about to close, it'll be there. And it was. I think, how do you get people to trust you? One of the ways is to show you really trust them and that you're not going to be on their backs all the time. You're not going to be micromanaging and say, oh, by the way, how are you getting on with that? If they come to you for advice, that's fine. So it's a bit of a circular answer, but I think trust builds trust.
Yeah. And I like that. It sounds like your team was sort of being their authentic selves by working when they wanted and when suited them, which probably shows that, you know, they felt comfortable, which is, again, is something else that we all need to be at work.
Yeah, I should say, and I say this in the book, this is pre-COVID, I tried to do this. I was actually overruled. My boss had said to me they wanted to see my team coming in every day. So I had to break this news to them. We were ahead of our time, as it turns out, but I still held to this thing. I still said to him, I still don't need you to tell me when you're going to the dentist. Really, you know, I don't need to look at you and see that you're at your desk. What's important is that the work gets done. And I think you know, you've got to set those standards. You've got to make clear what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. The organization has got to continue to function. It's got to succeed. But I think that's what's important, is to basically show you do trust them. In my experience, very few people let you down if you trust them. And most people are trustworthy. Yeah.
We need to believe in each other, in our capabilities. Here's another one. How do we persuade people not to be an enforcer? So this is an interesting question.
It's a very interesting question. I think there are always going to be leaders who try to be enforcers. And sometimes it works. It sometimes works. There are some people who are very powerful personalities who rule with a sort of fear. And yeah, sometimes it works. We're still going to have enforcers. I don't think we're going to get rid of it. But I think increasingly we're going to, as I say, there is a shortage of workers. At the moment, when it comes to selling labor, it's a seller's market. And I think those people who want to attract people, those people who want the best employees, are going to create the most productive workforces. So how can you persuade them? It's quite hard, in my experience, to persuade somebody who's got that kind of personality to give up that personality. But I think, you know, from a purely Darwinian perspective, I think we'll see people gravitating to those leaders who basically make them feel work is worth doing. So I don't know if you can change their minds, but I don't think they will thrive in the way that they once did.
Yes, I agree with that, definitely. What are your thoughts on a 4-day working week?
Well, this has been an experiment, hasn't it? And I think the result is that a 4-day working week proves to be pretty good. I think people are just as productive. I can remember a time, I'm old enough to remember a time when most adults went to work on a Saturday morning. Even if they had, even if their job was sort of normal, not antisocial hours. People used to work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday morning. That stopped. I don't think anybody was any the worse off for that. I think it's a very, very interesting experiment, the 4-day week. And I think what this comes back to is what I said earlier. I think the boundary between work and personal life, the boundary between work and family life is breaking down. And I think we're seeing people now, and maybe I think COVID helped to give this an impetus, not prepared to give up on the kind of things that they learned during COVID. You can be with your family. You can do other things. The FT had a report a couple of days ago saying that some of the top law firms are struggling now to get people to work the kind of crazy hours they used to expect them to work, because people don't think that's the life they want anymore. So I think that 4-day experiment, 4-day working experiment is a really, really interesting one. It's going to be very interesting to see where it goes.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Fingers crossed the results are good, right?
They seem to be so far.
Good, good. So with hybrid working, do you have any tips for sort of building relationships with your team if you're not seeing each other regularly in person?
It's a very good question. I think we're all feeling our way on this. I think it means communicating much, much more and more consciously than we used to. When people are in the office, it means really making sure you take the time to speak to them and spend some time with them, but also to use all of the other communication tools we have at our disposal at the moment. And we have so many of them. Whether it's WhatsApp or Slack or emails or, video blogs or whatever it is. I think what's required now, it's always been the case, and this is one of the things I discovered when I became a senior manager, is you can't over-communicate. People have got their own lives. They're not necessarily focused on exactly the things you're focused on. And I was a bit surprised that I would sometimes say things over and over and over again until I thought people must be getting bored with this. And it was only really when I felt I couldn't say it one more time that the message seemed to have got through. So I don't think you can, I don't think you can over communicate. I think you've just got to really, really put the effort into it and make sure that you just carry on doing it. And as I say, use every means available. I think, we're in the early days of this. I mean, we're really, really in our first year out of lockdown, if you think about it. And, at the times when we went back to work, there was always the fear, which then came to fruition, that we'd have to lock down again. And who knows what the future holds? There are some immunologists, people who study these things, who think that COVID-19 was a dress rehearsal. We might have far worse things to come. So I think we've got to develop these skills. And it's going to be interesting. This time next year, if we look at this again, we might say, well, we've learned this, we have to communicate in this way or that way. So I think it's just a question of using every opportunity you can and just understanding how important it is.
Absolutely. Sounds good. And you were talking about how, there are fewer people to do the jobs. Any ideas on what the working environment might look like in 5 years' time and what impact technology might have as well?
I think this is an absolutely vital issue. So I think a lot of jobs are going to be automated. And we spoke at the beginning, Eloise, about generative AI, ChatGPT and these things. I have seen technology fads come and go, and I've heard many, many times this is going to be the end of the world as we know it. So, there's some pretty alarmist things about ChatGPT, and we've got to take them seriously because people like Jeff Hinton, who helped develop ChatGPT, are really worried about it. I think a lot of things will be automated. I think generative AI will be able to do a lot of routine work. I don't think, a lot of the work, which is a lot of caring work, I don't think we've seen this in Japan, robotics and robots really aren't a replacement for the human touch. I think we're still going to see people needing to make big strategic decisions. a lot of jobs might be lost to ChatGPT, but that has happened with every wave of technology. Some people lose their jobs, others gain them. In the end, we've seen economies carry on and thriving. I think, you know, people will explore that, they'll investigate that. As I say, I'm slightly wary of exaggerating these trends because I've seen so many times people saying, oh, the world's never going to be the same. I talk about this in the book. I took, I think, 3 Uber trips last week. By now, Uber drivers were supposed to not exist. Self-driving cars were supposed to have taken over. It still hasn't happened. So who knows? I think one of the ways people will have to deal with this is greater automation, greater use of AI. How that's going to go, I don't think we really know yet.
Fascinating, fascinating. Well, thank you, Michael. I think we should do this again in a year's time, if possible.
It would be very interesting. If I could just add one other thing, Eloise, we've been talking about a lack of people coming into the workforce. And one thing we haven't really talked about, although I do talk about it in my book, is keeping people on in the workforce. And I think the idea that, you know, people disappear when they're in their late 50s or when they're 60 or even when they're 65, I think is going to become less and less feasible and less tenable. And I think one of the things that people are going to have to do is to hold on to more of their workers and to think about ways to do that. And chapter 2 in the book, where I talk about managing a multi-generational workforce, that is something that we could have actually had a whole session on as well.
Absolutely, yes, yes. And to plug that chapter, but also Linda Grattan's book, The 100-Year Life, you know, she
Exactly.
discusses that quite practically as well. Yeah. Fantastic. Right, so I'm just going to share my screen again. So if people want to follow you and find out what you're up to, they can find you on LinkedIn. Yes, I hope you know, maybe people will be sending you messages and questions.
Please do.
And what's happening next time? So June's business book of the month. Before I get too carried away, please fill in our poll just to tell us how you found the event. We're always looking for feedback. So June's business book of the month will be on Thursday, the 29th of June at 2 p.m. It will be the presentation book by Emma Ledden, and her masterclass will be make the next presentation you do the best you've ever done. So that sounds very exciting. I hope you'll sign up for our mailing list, and we hope to see you next time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michael. It's been fascinating, and yeah, we can definitely keep talking more about this in the future.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Eloise.
Bye.